There's this Jungian Dr. Kenneth James, who has a few great lectures on the topic of applying Jung's theories, integrating them with the tarot and such. And one of the elements he talks about, we have different ways of determining meaning in the events around us. So the first is causality. And of course, that is the primary framework. We're so used to it, we take it for granted that there's any other way of seeing the world. So causality being, this leads to that, which leads to that. And then the third way is synchronicity. This idea that several factors that sometimes occur at once seem to be tied together by this web of meaning. And the tarot is very much this system which is perfectly tailored to elicit, to invoke that kind of synchronous moment.
Welcome back to the transmission, my friends. One of the most odd, vexing things about the human psyche is how difficult it is to program. Like if there's something you don't want to do or don't want to think about, the last thing that works is telling yourself, I don't want to think about that thing. I don't want to think about a delicious, crunchy, salty chicken nugget in my favorite dipping sauce. You see? So this points to a problem. If there's something in our minds that we want to get behind, the direct route doesn't really work. We have to use more subtle, symbolic, archetypal means. Or we have to gradually change the quality of our mind through habit and hard work over time, and who wants to do that? But on the point of the more subtle and archetypal, one method that I've really been intrigued by as of late for doing that, for getting behind the thought objects in the mind, is tarot. And hear me out here, skeptics, because I used to be one of you. I used to be skeptical as well, but the more that I've learned about Jung, about archetypes, synchronicity, symbols, and just full-blown esotericism, honestly, I have taken another look. And in taking another look, I must say what I've found has been spooky. Maybe spooky is not the right word. I would say it's really perked up my wonder whiskers. I'm very tempted to get into specific examples now, but I will not drag out the intro. Anyway, our guest in this one, MjDorian, is another huge reason I've taken another look. He is a seeker, an esotericist, an artist. He creates a fantastic podcast called Creative Codex, which explores topics like Jung and alchemy. MJ is a tremendous storyteller, and he's going to be taking on this topic of tarot in coming episodes of his show. And that is what we're going to be doing in this Mind Meld, my friends, from a variety of angles, from the psychological angle, the archetypal angle, the esoteric angle, the historical. I'm going to stick my neck out. I am excited to present this Mind Meld to both the tarot-pilled masses and the non. Hopefully you'll see why by the end of this transmission. But everything you're going to need for MjDorian is in the description. Same for third eye drops. On that note, do me a favor, tickle that algorithm with a like, a sub, a comment, a share. It is truly of the utmost importance. We've also got over 300 mind melds that only exist in audio format. So do subscribe to Third Eye Drops wherever you listen to pods. And if you want to go deeper, you want to explore these mysteries and many more, join us over at patreon.com/Third Eye Drops. There's a thriving community over there, a patron-only Discord server, book club, other Zoom hangs. You get rewards and more. Again, patreon.com/Third Eye Drops. And with that, my friends, let's meld minds with MjDorian. You are one of my favorite people that I have met through the show in the last, ever.
Wow.
It is funny because the longer I've known you, the more kind of random things we find that we're both into. And I feel like it's just going to contribute to making like all these mind melds just that much more familial and
true.
Is kinly a word?
Kinley, it is now. Brotherly, yeah. Familial, yeah, absolutely. I'm into it, and I love everything you do here and the way you approach these topics. So it's an honor and a pleasure every time.
Likewise, man. I love your show, Creative Codex, and
Thank you.
Yeah, I know that's the thing that you say when you have a guest on a show, but it's sincerely incredible. Clearly, such a labor of love for you. All the layers of effort that you put into it. So if people haven't checked it out, do check it out. And speaking of
Thank you.
that, you are just starting a new series
Hmm.
on a topic that I've never directly done a deep dive on, but and I've always, like there's always part of me that's like, oh, these esoteric things, these divinatory things.
Hmm.
I don't know. I have mixed feelings. But I've really been trying lately to put that frontal lobe, critical
Hmm.
minded way of thinking aside, at least for the case of experiment, to see what comes out
Right.
of it. Have you? I think I might have asked you. Have you read Cosmic Trigger by Robert Anton Wilson?
I have it laying around here. Actually, I read it many years ago. I'm looking forward to opening it up again after you mentioned it the other day.
Yeah, yeah, and this is just so central to like the central pillar of that whole thing. And I was telling you I reread that recently.
Hmm.
Is is forget about believing, but take it seriously. Whatever the thing is, whether it's
Hmm.
a spiritual technique or a philosophy or a way of looking at the world, really, really try to live the experience of whatever that thing is without judgment. And then later on, you can come
Yeah.
out of it and form opinions if you want to.
Yep.
But largely, you'll find that when you go into that realm of not knowing, of experimentation, what he calls the chapel perilous, where you're not sure what's your own mind, what's the world, what's external forces,
Hmm.
you'll find that it's the labyrinth is considerably more mercurial and confusing and interesting than any POV can really fully capture.
Right. Right. Yeah. So I mean, my journey to kind of now become closer to the tarot has taken a very strange turn because let's say about like a decade ago or so when I was sorry, when I was first getting into studying esoterica and kind of these occult traditions, I was of course introduced to the tarot, and it was a very odd initial relationship where I have to admit that I was actually a bit afraid of it initially,
Mm,
and that fear colored my interactions with it over the years that followed to the extent that I would only use it in very small periods of time for like one reading here, one reading there, and it wasn't because I didn't believe in it. It was actually exactly the opposite. I was a little afraid of it
mm,
because the few times I had used it, it was in a sense like an all-seeing eye peered into the background, like behind the curtain where no one else sees, and it saw something and it presented it in front of myself and whoever else I was doing a reading with, and it freaked me out, that element of it. And so in my mind it was like, well, this thing has some kind of unspoken and unknown mechanism, and for now I'm not going to mess with it because I don't know what this is. And then it was only until recently I put a poll out for my show, and I said, what do people want to hear about in the upcoming episodes? Generally, the show tends to be about creative geniuses. And I put the tarot there as this kind of curiosity. And that one won out in both polls. And that perplexed me also. But the way now I kind of see it and the angle I can take with this is to say that, let's say one person created the tarot. Theoretically, that certainly is not the case, but let's say they did, and we can trace it to so and so in Italy in 1400. If that still existed, this stack of cards, and we looked at it and we said, "Wow, this was a work of creative genius," right?
right.
We would, without a doubt, say so. But the fact that it's existed for so long, we don't know who or what tradition it comes from, and it means so much to us. It is a work of creative genius. It just happens to be that it was worked on by society as a whole rather than one individual. And so that's the current angle I'm taking it with. And I've done a number of experiments recently with it. And now the relationship has shifted. It's more neutral. It's more of like, this is a tool, and there's a relationship forming there now.
Hmm, hmm. Yeah, that's a great point because I haven't. I mean, I've glancingly thought about the creative side of the tarot, But I guess I've always thought about it more from that more meta esoteric archetypal side. But that's a great point, that just the creative enterprise, like the multi-layered creative enterprise of creating a tarot deck, it's a big undertaking. You've put
Hmm.
a significant amount of thought into every single image, every single object on the card, like, because yeah, there's so much meaning. There's so much meaning that you can almost project additional meaning in
Oh,
terms of
sure.
what's there, but then that in and of itself is informative because it says something about the contents of the psyche.
Yes.
But speaking of the psyche, that was one of the things, like all of these esoteric practices, disciplines, curiosities. One of the things that really made me take another look at it is Jung, and
Hmm.
Jung's fascination with divination systems. Like, most famously,
Right.
he got very into the I Ching, um,
Hmm.
started experimenting with astrology, of course, which is very closely linked with the tarot. Um, and then that brings this whole other angle where, even if you're not sure, what the mechanism is, how it works, the fact that people with intellects like Jung are taking a look at these things and really taking them seriously and really
Hmm.
finding immense archetypal value and insight in them, it really makes you realize, like, okay, there's something going on here. It's deeper than just, I guess I don't even know how you dismiss the tarot, because if you do even a glancing study of the Rider Waite deck, for instance, which is the most famous one, and you figure out who
Hmm.
the people involved were, and you figure out, like, what they're symbolizing, and you figure out what a almost exhaustive symbol system it is.
Right.
It at the very least should evoke a lot of curiosity as to, what is this, where did this come from, what's going on here, and that will lead you into one of the deepest rabbit holes imaginable.
Right. Yeah. No, and there's so many other rabbit holes
Yes.
linked with that rabbit hole.
Yes.
This rabbit hole branches out like the roots of a tree, which is what endlessly fascinates myself and other people about it through the centuries. So not only is it the tarot as this system of divination, then throughout the centuries, people have also mm, elaborated and kind of ornamented it with other systems of thought, like Kabbalah, the Tree of Life, integrated into the structure of the cards, the Hebrew characters, and of course, up to the modern day, all other forms from pagan traditions to the myriad of thousands of variations on the tarot that are produced over every decade. And what's curious to also point out about, let's say, even just the Rider Waite deck, just talking historically, mm, it was initially published in the first few years of the 1900s, and by this company called the Rider Company, which is where the first word of its name comes from.
Hmm.
Rider Waite, Waite referring to Arthur Edward Waite, the occultist and designer of the cards. But we should also acknowledge that there was Pamela Coleman Smith, who was the actual artist that
Hmm.
then brought those designs to life. And so since that point in time, we know now, we can estimate that there are roughly 100 million Rider Waite tarot decks
Wow.
around the world.
Wow.
There's 100 million of these things in various places in people's households, in people's satchels that they carry around, and they have various relationships with this thing. And to think in terms of material, in terms of, let's say, taking it from a perspective of the Pentacles, this company, the Rider Company, if they've sold 100 million of these, I estimated the other day, they made roughly 1.5 billion on just the tarot
Wow.
alone. This tarot that just captures people's imagination, and I think part of it is also what you mentioned in terms of just the mystery of it, its potential Egyptian origins,
Oh, wow.
and things like that. Yeah,
Wow. Yeah, let's get into all of the above. And now we're already seeing how this rabbit hole fractals. But
right.
I think this would be a good point to introduce a concept that I brought up, because the idea of how something like this could work and may work, there's a few different lenses to apply. One is definitely what today we would call that archetypal sort of Jungian lens. But when we
Hmm.
go back further, and we go to someone who is intimately interwoven with Western esotericism as we know it today, one of these just absolute juggernauts of where so many things today that we still talk about come from is this late Platonist named Proclus.
Mm.
He's so we're talking 400s common era here.
Mm.
He ends up as the head of the revived Platonic Academy in Athens. And he's known as Proclus the systematizer sometimes because
Oh.
he wrote so much. He wrote so many commentaries, talked about so many things, and he approached them with this just like both really mystery and divine facing disposition, but also incredibly rigorous. Like he went
Mm.
through he was recognized as a genius. He became a lawyer. He, learned all of the traditional um, educational disciplines, studied math and logic, all these different things, was recognized by his teacher Syrianus as a genius, and he takes over the
Mm.
Platonic Academy from him when he's like 25 or some shit. And then he writes every single day. Like every single day he writes for the rest of his life. As such, we have a lot of writings from him. We have many lost
Mm.
writings, but we also still have many excellent writings from him, which is so exciting. And when you try to penetrate his writings, it is challenging, man. Like he is an intellect that is just like, first of all, just understanding the terminology, understanding the collective milieu that he's referring to. Um, it's complicated. However, when you do penetrate it, you see that he has commented on and if not explained almost everything
Mm.
that you could conceive of as esoteric. And
Mm.
one of these things is how oracular things could work. Things like the
Mm.
tarot could
Right.
work. And it all stems from this idea, a lot of people nutshell it today as above, so below, right? That there are these correspondences, this sympathy between all things higher and lower. And I did a whole video on this recently. You can take this in a multi-layered way. You can see it in science. You can see it in so many different ways. That is not hypothetical. But if you believe Proclus and anybody in the and not even just Western esoteric tradition, like this is central to like Chinese Taoist ideas as well. There are these natures to things,
Mm.
these symbolic harmonies to things. And the Greek word for this was symbolon or
Mm.
synthemata. So symbolon speaks to the word symbol and what a symbol
Mm.
actually is. And I seem to remember Jung saying, or maybe it was Campbell saying something like, a symbol is an image that operates in two worlds. It's
Mm.
it's it has a relevance in our world, but it's pointing to something that really exists archetypally in another world, or
Right.
the mundus imaginalis or whatever, as Jung would say. So you have this archetypal image that's here, but it's resonating with something deeper, in the collective unconscious, in the higher realm, in the whatever you want to call it. The nous is what Platonists would call it, like the realm of mind or whatever. So if you think of it that way, that everything, and this is very alchemical, this is very hermetic,
Sure.
and
Yeah.
they all took inspiration
I
from
take roots in that kind of line of thinking.
100%. And it all comes from this idea that there is this hierarchy of forces. There is this, and it overflows, it emanates down into the physical world, and everything takes on a hint, a trace. I think the Greek word is like inchos of
Mm.
these higher archetypal qualities. So this is where you get the idea of being able to create sacred talismans and sacred statues, and the idea that certain flowers carry certain archetypal essences, certain stones. And you can see how this just sort of explodes out into this enchanted worldview where
Hmm.
everything in nature, from planetary bodies to stones you find on the ground have some meaning, some significance in this like synchronistic,
Right.
sympathetic way. And
Yes.
if you imbue those symbols into a deck of cards, you're literally playing with this little distillation of these, what you could look at as these divine signatures or archetypal signatures.
Right.
And if you do that, you have this working, I don't know what to call it, like this working, living, breathing entity that you can communicate with. And
Right.
like I said, I always have that skeptical part of me. I'm always just like, what the fuck am I doing? I'm playing with little cards with pictures on them.
Sure.
But when you start playing with them yourself and you take it even remotely seriously, I, at least over the last couple of days, I mean, you and I have been talking a lot. I, at least over the last couple of days, have been, my astral body has just been kicked straight in the nuts, man. Just it's just like I'm one of those people who, if I see something and I'm like, that's not great, I'll kind of just hold that and be honest with myself. Every
Right.
single time I've done a serious poll, like, this is my question, this is what I'm trying to address,
Hmm.
it's been just like, oh my God, just
Just hits you. Yeah.
unbelievable. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, you're hitting on synchronicities. I think part of it, in my experience, in terms of just the use of the tarot and engaging some of the mechanism, this kind of synchronous mechanism that occurs, does have to do with emotion. And so when you ask it a question that is charged with some sense of an emotion, then I mean, I'm not going to go the metaphysical route. I'm just going to say that whatever happens after the fact in the one or two cards or more that are revealed, they cause a reaction. And, you know, I think it would be useful. There's this Jungian uh, Dr. Kenneth James, who has a few great lectures, and he continues to lecture in the C.G. Jung Institute of Chicago on the topic of applying Jung's theories, integrating them with the tarot and such. And he's very, very, very good with it. And one of the kind of elements he talks about in one of the introductions to this topic is this idea that we have at least three different ways of determining meaning in the events around us. And so it's kind of useful to frame the conversation, at least part of it, in this sense, because we can keep referring back to like, well, was that a causal type of thinking, or is that this synchronous type of thinking? So the first way of kind of creating meaning out of our lived experience and the events around us is causality. And of course, that is the primary mode, the primary framework in the Western world that we apply to everything around us. And we're so used to it, we take it for granted that there's any other way of
Mhm.
seeing the world. So causality being, uh, this leads to that, which leads to that. It's
Yeah.
very point A, point B, point C. Nothing can occur which doesn't have this kind of linear quality to it that goes back in time to several other things that caused it, or one other root cause. But then the problem with causality, as effective as it is, it's basically what's allowed us to have science, what's allowed us to have medicine, because we can say, this disease seems to, the symptoms of it seem to improve when you take this medicine, and so on. But the problem with causality is, at some point, there's no end to that logic chain,
Right.
because you can say, well, how did we end up doing this show today? Well, it was because two people, a man and a woman, had
Yeah. Yeah.
conceived me in Poland that many years ago, which led to this moment. And it's like, well, at some point there's something that has to do with maybe a subjective choice that cuts off the chain.
Right.
And
Right.
and so that's an interesting element of causality. Then so he then says the second way we make sense of events around us is temporality, which is just that sometimes events happen at the same time, but that can be hard to create meanings out of, like the fact that when I dropped my tarot deck, the bus made a beep sound across the street. And then the third way is synchronicity, which has to do with this idea that several factors that sometimes occur at once seem to be kind of tied together by this web of meaning, and we react to it emotionally.
Yeah.
And puts aside all metaphysical implications. This is just, there's a mechanism at work, and it creates a moment of meaning for us. And the tarot is very much this divinatory system, which is is kind of like perfectly tailored to to invoke that kind of synchronous moment.
Yeah.
And that's part of what creeps people out about it. I think why initially maybe I felt that fear about it is because you don't see why and how that mechanism is working. But approaching it in a causal way, like, you shuffle the deck, you get an answer, maybe it doesn't give you an emotional reaction, so you say, like, let me shuffle it and do this 3 more times and I'll write out my results. That kind of causal thinking doesn't work with the tarot. Instead, it's kind of this spontaneous and ritualistic approach that
Yeah.
instead, it favors much more.
Yeah, it feels like a conversation because
Yes.
if you do something like I have this question and then you don't like it or you do whatever, you can say to yourself, I'm asking the same question again, but you have to realize that it's like at least this is my experience. It's like the deck answers back with what you're really thinking about. Like you
Right.
can't pull one over on it. Like by saying,
No.
"No, this is what I'm doing." Whatever this is it's operating at this level underneath what exactly like what you're describing. It's acting underneath that chronological A happened, then this domino fell over, the billiard ball kind of um sequential physics. It's
Right.
whatever it is. I don't know if it's what you whatever. We don't need to get into the theory of it. But yeah, the sensation that you're talking about, that it seems to be looking at you in a very private way
Yeah.
where it gets right into your head and it's very
Right.
synchronistic. It's like this. It's really like it's like a little kairos generator, like the chronos versus
Mm.
kairos. This that the Greeks had this idea of another kind of time. It wasn't just chronological time; it was kairos, and
Mm.
kairos is like the right time. And you could think of synchronicities as like a little orgasm of kairos, right? It's just
Mm.
erupts into the world, and it seems like these tools, like these oracular tools, are ways to tap into that energy somehow. And again, that goes back. I don't know if I ever fully put a sensical period on why I brought Proclus into this conversation,
Mm.
but that's essentially it. Is that there are these symbols and these qualities that all contain these symbolon or synthemata. And if you know that, if you can read that language, if you know how to use that language, you can tap into these archetypal powers. And it seems like that's exactly what this deck is. And it can feel very, very personal sometimes because
Right.
talking about feeling like my subtle body was kicked in the nuts. The thing you got to do before you kick someone in the nuts is look at them, right? And because it definitely feels like it's looking at them. It's like, oh, look at these right here. This is what you want. Bam. That's really what it feels like playing with
Right.
this deck over the last couple of days.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, and so those many years ago when I first initially had my experiences with tarot, I was younger, a little more naive, and perhaps less wise. So I was, a bit of a naughty boy occasionally, because as an artist, uh, every artist goes through a period of time where they're a bit nihilistic about the world, because you look at things very objectively, look at society objectively, you
Right.
look at, laws and morals, and you see them kind of as these traditions rather than as these like fixed in stone ideas. And so uh, I had my period of time where I was doing things that maybe looking back, I regret. So I had laid out the cards with someone, and I said, okay, when you get a card, that's going to represent who you are, and when I get a card, it's going to represent who I am at this moment in time. They got their card. I got my card. I turn it over. It's the devil in the Thoth tarot deck. And I was like, what? What? Like, it kind of shook me, even just the visual, obviously. And then I was like, okay, let me look up the meaning. Maybe it's not as bad as it seems. The first sentence of the meaning of that card was, um, in that deck, the unseen plans being put into motion. And I was like,
Wow.
shit, it got me. And then I was like, okay, let's put this away. And then I didn't revisit it for like another few months or another year. And that initial impression of it, looking behind the curtain and being like, I could see you. I know
Yeah.
what you are. and here's a way to remind you, what path you're currently on. So that always stuck with me, and that was why I ended up having a little bit of fear about it. But so in recent memory, I went on this experiment with the tarot that reshaped my relationship to it. And it sounds like maybe it's kind of inspired maybe your own relationship with the tarot. And initially, I just wanted to get the conversation going. So I said I would do 7 days where each night before bed, I would draw just 2 cards after asking the tarot a direct question, shuffling them multiple times and laying out kind of these 2 rows, picking 2 cards, not necessarily one from each row, just wherever my hand felt was right. And each time I got an answer, I was either initially kind of taken aback by how immediately uh, direct it was at referring to what I asked it from the 78 cards that it contains and the infinite combinations one can create. Or the other reaction was, huh, what could that imply? I didn't reshuffle them. I didn't do it again. I took the tarot at its face value and assumed that it knew what it was talking about. The following day, always after I slept on it, if I didn't understand that meaning initially, it became so obvious when I woke up. Even within an hour of me waking up, I was like, oh, of course. That's what it's referring to, because and in answer to the question, and what's interesting about, I would say, is more a Jungian way of reading these cards. You shouldn't stick to their literal meaning as much, because when you look at even there's a book by one author. I remember the book is called The Tarot Dictionary, and so what she does is she catalogs every single card with every definition that every major author that's spoken
Yeah.
about the tarot has written. So there's Crowley's definition for the Page of Swords. There's Greer's. There's Rachel Pollack's, and so on. And what you end up realizing as you look at them is like that these people who have had these long experiences with the deck have formed their own impressions and
Yeah.
their own associations with these cards. And so the goal, and in each one of those pages in the Tarot Dictionary, there's also a space for you to write what your own impressions are. And essentially, that's the goal of this kind of practice, is you want to react to the imagery, perhaps even more so than the literal meaning of the card in a dictionary or in a source. And so, for example, here's my first reading. I asked the tarot. I believe I just wanted to initiate the conversation and just see what is the first thing to be on my mind as I
Hmm.
start the journey. And the tarot gave back the 6 of Swords and the Sun. The 6 of Swords is someone in a rowboat, and there's 6 swords placed into it, and it looks like they're going into the distance of a city on the water. And then the Sun, obviously, is a very jubilant scene. There's a child, and it's very much like a grand awakening.
Hmm.
And the phrase that came into mind the moment I saw those 2 cards in front of me was, "So begins the journey of the Sun."
Mm.
The journey towards fuller consciousness, the journey
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
realization. And it was these kinds of things and these questions, every night I would ask it. Some of them were more personal than others. Like I asked it once about a specific dream symbol that I used to have recur in my dreams, which was of a serial killer chasing me. I asked it uh, a personal question regarding my brother and the path he took in life, which had to do with where did he go wrong? Because his path, he's still alive, but I make it sound like he passed away. But his path took a very different. So I asked, what happened with my brother? What did his life, why did his life take such a different path than mine? And it gave me the 7 of Pentacles and the 6 of Trumps, which is the Lover's card.
Oh, wow.
And so I had to reflect on this quite a bit. This was kind of one of those where the next day, the the answer became more and more clear. And the 7 of Pentacles shows what could be a farmer or a peasant next to a bush that contains these seven pentacles kind of entwined. It's assumed that they're growing like fruits off of this
Yep.
bush that he's tended to, and he's about to harvest. And then, of course, the Lover's card shows a man and woman, one in front of looks like a flaming bush, the woman in front of a tree with a snake, and behind them a
Yeah.
divine figure, right?
I'll put the cards up when we're in the edit.
So what I wrote in response and reflecting on it the next day was that the two cards form a statement about individual responsibility and fate/destiny, being the second card. We all have a certain destiny or fate laid out for us by our biology, the environment we grow up in, the faults of our parents, challenges we face in our upbringing. But then there is also the reality of our individual responsibility, which is represented by the farmer doing the work of harvesting. And that is the potential harvest from our own individual choices and
Yeah.
work. So it's
Mm-hmm,
like
mm-hmm.
this combination. And so I wrote, my brother, although not provided the best of fates, also did not do much in the direction of altering said fate. He did not seem to respect this law of the realm of pentacles/material reality, that an action has and will return an effect, a reaction, which will also have its own consequences. So that gave me some,
Wow.
some sense of light
Yeah.
and
Yeah, you
understanding.
could it seems like you could really interpret that as a sort of like a reaping of what you've sown. Like
Yeah.
like the 7 of pentacles and the farmer could represent like a sort of like you're planting seeds, right? And
Hmm.
through your actions you're planting these seeds, and eventually there's going to be a union between you, the things you've done, and that's going to lead to the sowing of the reaping of what you've sown, and you could see like the union of those two things as the lovers or something. Um so yeah, that kind of that makes sense, man. And maybe we should like we definitely I don't want to get into a whole technical explanation of how they work and what they symbolize, but one thing I think that is interesting to talk about is, one, for sure, you can really do shadow work or work on the unconscious through the cards and using
Hmm.
them like Rorschachs, right? Like not
Right.
knowing what they actually symbolize and just being like, oh, this makes me think of this or reminds me of this, and that is very Jungian and that is very interesting. However, despite the fact that there can be numerous interpretations, there is intention and there is tremendous amount of meaning embedded in them. Like
Hmm.
you have the different suits. Each suit is associated with an element, with an archetype,
Right.
with certain elements in life. Swords are air, wands are fire, pentacles are earth, cups are water. Right? That's I believe.
Hmm. Right.
Um, and then if you know what those things represent in Western esotericism, then that brings a layer of meaning. Um, and while we're talking about specific pulls that really drop your pants again, this morning just before this, like I've admittedly to the audience been having like kind of a tough time as of late with the grind, with a lull in growth, with just all the things wrapped up in doing this. And I almost don't want to say this because it feels like blowing out the birthday cake candle and telling people to wish or something. um So in the spirit of that, I'm going to split the difference. And in the spirit of swords, I'm going to split the difference. And I'm not going to say exactly what I pulled and all of the meanings, but I will say that the suit that represents communication and is associated with the Mercury archetype and air is swords. I did a three
Hmm.
card pull. Every single card I pulled was a sword card.
Hmm.
So just things like that are just the odds are low, first of all. But second of all, the fact that the three that I pulled created such a coherent progression. And
Hmm.
I should also say that there's a common way of doing this where you select three cards. The first card is this sort of overview of your situation. The second card is the challenge. The third card is the approach or strategy or solution or attitude you should take toward the question or the problem. And all three of the things immediately, and admittedly I don't have the deck memorized, so I had to look up like, okay, what is this, what is this, what is this, and it was just like a very clear, like, there was no meditating on it. It was just like, oh,
Right.
there's, okay, you're doing some kind of astral colonoscopy on me once again. Great, just every single time. That's what it's felt like. So I don't know if there's just like something in the air these last couple of days, or what it is,
Mm.
but it's just it's massively, um it's felt massively on the mark every time for
Right.
me.
Now, here's what's really interesting to think about, right? So let's say if we want to take kind of skeptics view of this,
Yeah.
we can first initially say that there's 78 cards, there's 22 major arcana, there's 56 minor arcana. We've shuffled them together. It's essentially it's like two decks of cards that have very different meanings and references. Then there's also the court cards, which are part of the minor arcana, which include the page, the knight, the queen, and the king, which have their own kind of embodiments of their particular suit. So, there's so many associations. Now, taking the skeptic's view, we can say, like, well, from that assortment, and then shuffling out and pulling out three cards, how many of those potential three card combinations would cause an emotional reaction in you based on your current kind of
Hmm.
unconscious pressure that you're feeling in the situation that you're in? The likelihood is that that's not the only combination that would cause that emotional reaction, right?
Definitely
The
agree.
likelihood is that there's probably a few dozen, maybe there's 24 different combinations or more. And I think what's going on, let's say functionally, if we want to take the skeptic's view, would be that our unconscious feels pressure. That's why I was saying an emotional question is particularly uh, uh, adequate at use at addressing to the cards, is because you already are your unconscious either wants to make you realize something, or you have a desperate question that needs answering. And so whatever is put in front of you, you're searching for something, and in the process of that searching, uh, it occasionally hook on to something that you need, and kind of just it pulls it out of the unconscious,
Yep. Yep.
oftentimes something that you couldn't really pull at yourself, so you needed this other mechanism to make it come out.
Hmm. Hmm.
I would think that that's one, I feel, a satisfactory explanation for that, which again maybe entices people who are a bit skeptical about the cards to try it themselves, because there's still great value in it, whether you buy into the metaphysical element of it and the tree of life, and that all things are connected through invisible threads and such, that there's still something at work that is beneficial to you psychologically.
Well said. Well said. Yeah. And that's what I was getting at with that sort of Rorschach way of looking at it,
Hmm.
because there is no, I mean, I'll even go further. I think any combination of cards, if you're a sufficient storyteller to yourself, you can obviously find meaning, because there's no card that doesn't have deep levels of meaning
Oh yeah, they're all
that
archetypal. Yeah.
that aren't relevant to whatever's going on in your life. The question is there some further dimension
Right.
as to why you picked what you picked, or is it all just you as the agent gaslighting yourself to a place where you don't know what you're getting, and then like you said, that you explained it way better than I did, with the Rorschach thing. um is it all just you doing conversing with your own unconscious? And whatever it is, I'd be lying if I said I don't care, because I do care, because I do want this, the more like Western esoteric way of seeing to be
Yeah,
real.
sure, why not?
But in the Robert Anton Wilsonian spirit of like the perennial agnostic, like, I just don't know. I admit that I don't know,
Mm,
but I do
mm,
think that there's so much time. Anybody who gets into Jung, or anyone who gets into self work, or trying to whatever, there's always this conundrum of, how do I get past my thoughts? How do I get past my ideas? How do I get at this nebulous thing that is bothering me, or this question that I have? And you've got to do something to
right,
get underneath that. And this is,
right,
regardless of how you're getting there, this is a way to do that. This is a way to
sure.
get past your thoughts, because you don't know what you're going to pick. You don't know how it's going to land on you. And that in and of itself is very instructive and interesting.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So perhaps we mentioned that Jung didn't directly comment, only very briefly, on the tarot. I mean, the guy was so deeply immersed in alchemy and his own theories and investigations of
Yeah,
the mind that, I mean, he could only, if he had two more lifetimes, he could really like
right.
tear the tarot apart. But there are other indications of his perspective on these things, and of his colleagues' perspective on these things, through things they've said about divination, let's say, which apply here. So, one example being Marie-Louise von Franz, one of Jung's closest colleagues and students. She wrote many, many books on various Jungian kind of theory topics. One of them that I was recently reading, called Alchemical Active Imagination. Wonderful book. And with I find with von Franz, it's her asides that are occasionally even revelatory compared to like her main
Mhm.
like thesis that she's working on. Like, she's going on and on and on and on for pages, and then she says something in two sentences, just like, and by the way, so and so, and then it's like, what? And it blows your mind, and then she goes back to like the really technical scholarly stuff, and it's her asides that really always, to me, are mind-blowing. So in this book, she's talking about divination, and she's going through the various types of divination from in ancient cultures, from geomancy to hydromancy. And then she mentions that there's a village in Switzerland where the people of the village uh, can tell who'll die next by looking at the cracks in the road that connects the church and the graveyard.
Wow.
So
Okay.
so after they, have buried someone, they kind of walk along this road, and by kind of gazing at the cracks, they kind of spontaneously determine like who's going to be the one who dies next. And so she writes about this, and she says, I'll read this directly: irregular crack patterns are frequently used for bringing up the knowledge of the unconscious. The technique of melting lead is the same thing. To my mind, these things have to do with a catalyzing effect. I do not believe that the cracks actually do foretell anything, but our unconscious knows. For instance, in that
Mm.
group of people, their unconscious knows through its absolute knowledge who is going to die next, but they cannot bring it up directly. They have to look at the confused patterns of cracks which catalyze the projection. Unquote.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. That it's not the crackomancy, that there's a deeper knowing that we're all we're all tapped into, right? And sometimes you just
Those
need
crack wizards out there.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Which multiple ways to approach that discipline. Um, I can think of at least 3. But
Oh, sure.
but yeah, and I think this is exactly it. And it's weird because the snake eats its tail here, because regardless of how you're looking at it, if it's through this broadly Jungian way or psychological way where it's like, yeah, something in the unconscious mind already knows, and it hasn't quite bloomed into the
Mhm.
conscious mind yet. Well, that essentially is the Western esoteric viewpoint, because the Western esoteric viewpoint, which again we inherit from Platonists and even pre-Socratics, is this idea of nous, this idea of mind at large, and that we participate in mind at large. Not, we're not the holders of it. It shines down into each individual through the prism of their own being and creates its own individual sense of self. But when you go into these deeper states, you can reach what Jung would call unconscious, maybe even eventually collective unconscious, or like spirit of the depths or whatever.
Mhm.
Um, but I'm almost certain, the exact same phenomenological experience
Right.
as what they're talking about there, where it's like, Plotinus or whatever Platonist or um, Greek mystic, Hellenistic mystic, talking about going past, you know, the shadows on the wall of Plato's cave and going into these deeper ways of knowing until you're getting into intellect with a capital I, or mind with a capital M. Nous is again their word. So it's like all this stuff, regardless of how you approach it, it seems like it's getting at that there are these deeper kinds of knowing that we don't have access to in a Cartesian dualist kind of way. But when you do
Mm.
something like present yourself with an archetypal image, it retrieves something from
Right. The
deeper
retrieval.
in you. And
Yeah.
it's I just got this is interesting. I just got a very clear image, snapshot image of in my mind of a fisherman like putting like casting a reel down into
Yeah.
the unseen waters and pulling up something surprising. And that's
Yes.
what it feels like
That's
with
what it
these
feels like.
cards. Yeah.
Yes, very much so. Very much so. Yeah. And just interesting side note about this idea of Western esotericism. So in the various traditions of Western esotericism, up to the modern day, the writers on it and such. Like for example, this one French esotericist, Jean Dubuis, who created the alchemy course that I practice, and also another amazing, highly recommended course called Fundamentals of Esoteric Knowledge. So in these courses, he kind of elaborates on these kinds of mechanisms, the way that an esotericist would understand them in the modern time, and they do talk about things like the unconscious. And so, from the modern esoteric view, the unconscious obviously exists, and they acknowledge it, but they see it as the gateway to the
Mhm,
spiritual
mhm.
realms, that it's actually through the unconscious that we receive those emanations, messages, and the connecting point into the more spiritual realities. And so that's when I remember reading that the first time, I was kind of taken aback. So I was into Jung and stuff, and I was like, oh, so that point where Jung refuses to go past for probably professional reasons, these esotericists now take the next step and say, well, yes, the spiritual stuff exists, um, and you can access it first by kind of passing through the unconscious. And so there's some interesting kind of things to reflect on there.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think this is a perfect opportunity to get more into the connections we haven't talked about with people like A.E. Waite and how we know for a fact that there's certain imagery embedded in these decks. And
Hmm.
it's not just because, you know, someone, I can still imagine a skeptical person who hasn't done the legwork thinking all of this stuff is just projection and that there is no deeper symbol system or intention really mindfully embedded in every figure and every object in this deck. So let's get into that. And you also told me you have a story about supposed links that stretch back to ancient Alexandria and stuff. So let's
Yeah.
get into all this stuff.
Yeah, so it's a wonderful pivot. So the story goes that in the great library of Alexandria, where there were countless priceless artifacts, there was also one very special book. And in this book was contained the spiritual wisdom and symbols of ancient Egypt.
Hmm.
Now, by the time of the second century, the Library of Alexandria became under almost constant threat of a destruction from invading forces. And even at one point, Caesar himself set a part of the library on fire through a siege that they were doing. So the custodians of this work, of this book of wisdom, they, out of fear, decided to tear out all of the images from the book, separate them from the text, and arrange them into a deck of cards, disguising this book of wisdom as a card game. So the question
Mm.
would be why? And the idea is that they were preparing this wisdom to be forever hidden in plain sight, so that it would be available for true seekers who are worthy of those mysteries to find it and access it and understand it that way. And interestingly enough, to this day, tarot practitioners continue to call the tarot deck a book. And so there's some fascinating kind of
Yeah.
origin myths going on with the tarot itself in that way.
And depending what period of time this would have occurred, there's another very practical reason for doing this. And it's because as you have the rise of institutionalized Christianity in those power
Hmm.
holders, the idea of doing anything that could be construed of as pagan or polytheist or ritualistic becomes
Hmm.
increasingly persecuted to a point where there are not only arrests, but, you know, very famous murders and
Oh, sure.
like, yeah, just tortures and stuff of people who are considered bastions of that old guard and way of thinking. You know, one of the most famous ones um, in the motivations and targeting are all debatable for this, but one of the most famous ones is the murder of Hypatia, the Platonic
Mm,
uh, female philosopher in Alexandria, who
really?
is, yeah, she's murdered by a Christian mob, and yeah, it's
Wow.
one of the most,
Jeez.
and she's, and she taught Christians and Hellenists, by the way. Like she wasn't,
Hmm.
antagonistic toward Christians. She
Right.
actually
No, of
taught
course.
one of the one of the guys who ends up becoming bishop. It might have been Synesius. I think it was
Hmm.
Synesius. She teaches him, and he says like she is a like a great woman. Like she's not to be, in so many words, she's not to be fucked with. But then as he, I believe he ages out, if I'm not mistaken, and
Hmm.
retires, and his power goes away, and then tensions just keep increasing, and she's eventually targeted and murdered in a very
Jeez.
famous tragic episode.
Oof.
um
Messed up,
but
man.
yeah, so the idea of needing to obscure certain
Right.
things and needing to be very, very careful about certain things
Right.
is hugely important, and you start to see a lot of these things go underground,
Yeah.
or be neutered, be very spiritually neutered, be like, yes, we're Platonists, we're
Like
like
watered
academic
down.
Platonists, we're not,
Right.
and or maybe, and there were many Christian Platonists as well, but yeah, so that there could be multiple reasons for the seemingly keeping these things occulted, or dressed up in trivial, like, oh, it's just a deck of cards, look, it's nothing.
Yeah. 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 So very early on, and let's say that even in written documents, people started to associate the tarot with ancient Egypt. The earliest writing we have on that is from a pastor by the name of Antonio Cort de Gebelon,
Hmm.
and he wrote a book called The Primitive World, and in French. And basically, he kind of investigated various traditions and practices of so-called primitive people. And among them, one chapter that was published in 1781 was about the tarot. And so he had no stake or claim in this. He didn't run a lodge of hermetic magicians or anything. But he put forward this theory that contained within the symbols of the tarot were indications of practices and symbols of ancient Egypt. And so, because of him, Chebelon, later on, the esotericists in the 1800s, 1900s, they used him kind of as a way to continue that thread of thought. But perhaps it would be interesting to point out a few of these kind of idiosyncrasies about the tarot,
Yeah.
which don't really fit into the predominantly Catholic Western worldview that was in the 1700s and earlier. So let's say even the card of the second of the major arcana, the High Priestess.
Hmm.
Some of these are so ubiquitous to us, we don't give it a second thought. But if you think about the High Priestess for a second, in the context of, let's say, the argument that the tarot originated around the 1400s, in northern Italy when it first appeared, well, we're talking about, again, a very Catholic Western worldview. And where does the high priestess fit into that?
Yeah.
Where is there a high priestess
Hmm.
in the
Hmm.
context
Hmm.
of Catholicism? It doesn't exist. And especially in the context of, uh, her being placed almost at the forefront of the major arcana. And so there are theories that, well, this is a remnant of the original Egyptian cards, the original Egyptian symbols. And so we look through history and we find that, yes, in Egypt, high priestesses had very important place in society.
Yeah.
And not only that, even Pharaoh's daughters were often given the position, like one example being the god's wife of Amun.
Mm.
And so this was a very a position with great notoriety and respect, and even lower positions of just priestesses in temples in the basic documents of day-to-day transactions. You can see that those priestesses were paid equal to the male priests of the time. So maybe high
Yeah.
priestess links
Yeah.
ancient
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Egypt.
Well, the other thing that's impossible not to talk about here is, are you familiar with Ficino?
No, please.
Oh man, so he is this Renaissance figure, and I'd have to look exactly at the dates of his activity to know how much it corresponds with what you're talking about, but I believe they're right around the same time. He is a patron of the it's slipping my mind, the Medici. I think the Medici's, like one of those
Hmm.
like really influential Italian families, and he starts reviving the Greco-Egyptian esoteric thread. He
Hmm.
personally translates all of the Hermetic works, all of the Platonic works,
Hmm.
and writes edgy stuff for being in a Catholic milieu. And he becomes a priest, like he becomes a Catholic, um, either priest or bishop, I believe. And
Hmm.
he gets in kind of in trouble and has to defend what he's
Oh, yes.
doing. But some of his work later gets undebatably esoteric and Western,
Hmm.
planetary magic and alchemy and all that kind of stuff comes directly into his work as he starts to get older. So the Greco-Egyptian esoteric symbolism and the line is alive at this point. Like it's
Hmm.
definitely traveling in circles in Europe at that point in like the 1400s.
1400s,
So
I see.
you could do honestly, you could do a whole series on that guy, man. He is
Hmm.
very,
Really
very interesting. I want to do a deeper dive into him too, because
interesting.
yeah, I mean, imagine just the undertaking to, you know, revive all of these things that were lost or translate all of these things that were lost into common languages for the very first time. Like,
Hmm.
and the explosion of thought that would come off of having access to those texts for the first time in hundreds or thousands of years is massive.
Right. Right. Very fascinating. Yeah. I mean, I know that as far as translation of Egyptian hieroglyphs was concerned, the first
Yeah.
time that that officially was confirmed was in the late 1800s that we were able to do that. So before then, it was all speculation as far as hieroglyphics were concerned and
Mhm.
what they meant and things like that, which makes it, I think, this even more compelling. The idea of like little indications throughout the cards that are kind of almost remnants. There's also the card of the star,
Yeah.
which is beautiful. It's one of, I think, most people's favorites. Just it's shows a woman with two vases or pitchers, and she's pouring water. One pitcher is pouring back into what you'd assume was the source of where she got the water, which is a pool of water, and then the other pitcher is pouring on the land. And so there's various implications here. There's some people that say it's related to the age of Aquarius, to the symbol of Aquarius and such. But we have to consider, well, how what can we see in this card if we're going to assume the Egyptian connection? And there's a very compelling element here,
Mm.
and it's the story of Isis. After Osiris was killed, she cried a river, and this became the River Nile. And every year there was an annual festival in Egypt, which the River Nile flooded. And during that flooding process, it was said that that was Isis pouring water into the Nile and flooding it. And this is clearly can be seen as what's depicted in the star card. It's a woman pouring water into a body of water, and then the other is being poured onto land, forming little rivers. So, is it one? Is it the other? Is
Yeah.
it both? Is it just the influence kind of going down through thousands of years, just kind of as a remnant in people's stories and their imagination? And we've lost those stories in the modern world, but they still, have their effects.
Yeah, man. Yeah, this it's worth pausing here and reflecting on the depth and truly ancient nature of Egyptian wisdom. And
Mm.
there's a couple statistics that are always mind-blowing. One is that it's longer from Cleopatra, or I'm sorry, no, it's longer from the building of the Great Pyramid by conventional dating, even. So
Mm.
if it's older, this is even more true. It's longer to that than Cleopatra than Cleopatra to now. So
Oh,
there's this
wow.
loss of their own wisdom that occurs. Like,
Mm.
they can't read their own hieroglyphs. Like, I believe at the time of her, for instance, where
Mm.
we're talking, I forget the exact year she was born, but late antiquity sometime. Like, I don't believe they can read their own hieroglyphs even, or if they can, it's
Mm.
like probably some very limited priestly class, and the knowledge has largely gone away. um so that's one thing worth reflecting on, is just how ancient this is and how deep it goes, and how opaque it still is to us, like what they were really doing, what they really meant. And obviously there's
Mm-hmm.
whole channels on YouTube and books built on these, like, um semi-historical conspiracy theory, which I love. I'm not using that
Sure.
in a pejorative way. um but also, one of the things we do know, because this is a common theme among Babylonians, Egyptians,
Mm.
Greeks, pretty much this whole ancient world blanket statement: the cosmos is enchanted. The
Mm.
planets are the visible manifestation of gods. The stars are the visible manifestation of gods. So when you see stars and planets in these ancient carvings, in any kind of ancient imagery, it's a multi-layered statement. Like, they are accurately like, in many cases, there's always like, wow, how are they so accurate about the night sky? They knew where this was, and they copied very famously um the pyramids of Giza perfectly
Mm.
mirror what today we call Orion's belt, but it's really
Mm-hmm.
Osiris. um
Mm.
and it's because they are trying to make a physical version of divine powers on the planet, and they're trying to
Mm-hmm.
draw down these divine godly powers from the stars themselves. And this is really like a worldview that endures until, very very much like all these other ideas, like we were talking about, this like sympathy, this web of enchantment, really, that runs throughout the world and the cosmos. This is something that runs throughout, almost clearly it's very indigenous as well. That all of these things have spirits and are, you could think of them as almost like nature gods. It's not until monotheistic religions comes and like
Mm.
whitewashes everything as forbidden,
Right.
at least according to mainstream sources. I'm sure people in this video will drop all sorts of like, um the tarot is evil, all this stuff they're talking about is pagan bullshit, believe in this, don't believe in that. I'm sure if this video does well, it's going to get those comments. um
Sure.
so this is something that is, it's incredibly ancient, this idea of the enchanted world and cosmos, and that these are real powers in the world that we are at least distantly related to. um and it's so beautifully poetic, because we now know that we're literally, and pretty much everything, it's commonly said that we're stardust, right? But so is pretty much everything. Like, pretty much everything, if you look
Mm.
at how, elements are thought to exist, they all have to be gestated in stars, and they all have to
Sure.
be born out of stars. And yeah, and when you think about that as not just this mechanistic thing, but something with real significance, with real purpose, with real symbolic archetypal layers to it, that makes a car like the Star hit pretty hard, because
Right.
once again, we haven't even gotten here yet. But that question that I posed before, that we're kind of slowly moonwalking into, how we know that these are deeply symbolic, deeply informed by Hermeticism and Western esotericism. Um, and I think now, again, this might be a good segue into that, because we arrive eventually down this train to the guy mostly responsible for creating the most popular deck today, the Rider Waite deck, AE Waite. So, um,
Right.
long ramble, but I would love to hear you riff on him and his significance and who he was.
Sure. Yeah. The creator of definitely the most popular tarot deck currently in existence. Again, which has an estimated 100 million copies worldwide. It's kind of mind blowing.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, Arthur Edward Waite, he owes credit to Eliphas Levi, because from my understanding, it was Eliphas Levi who first paired the cards of the major arcana with Hebrew characters.
Hmm.
And so the knowledge of these various occultists builds on itself. And it culminates in the late 1800s, early 1900s in an organization called the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, of which Arthur Edward Waite was a member. Also, Pamela Coleman Smith was a member, because this was a group that took both men and women. Aleister Crowley was a member. William Butler Yeats was a member. And so these various occultists in Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, they combine the tarot with the Hebrew characters, and also the next leap, which would be with the Tree of Life from the tradition of Kabbalah, and which there's some very compelling arguments to be made there, because in the Tree of Life, which is made up of these 10 what are called Sephiroth, these
Yeah.
10 energy orbs, which you can make an immediate association to the 10 numbered cards of each of the suits and such, but also in Kabbalah, those 10 Sephiroth, not only do they have their own qualities, but there are these paths which connect them, which are the 22 paths, and that these are kind of these life paths and paths of energy throughout creation. And so again, 22 major arcana, the 22 paths that connect, the 10
Yep.
Sephiroth and the Tree of Life, the 22 Hebrew characters. Each Hebrew character also matches up with one of the paths. And so naturally, the members of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, ceremonial magicians, it wasn't black magic that they were practicing. It was just ceremonial magic.
Yeah.
And they elaborate on these connections to great lengths, and this kind of becomes a core of their, you could say, belief system, or their framework, to the extent that whoever was joining this order, they had to study Hebrew, then they had to kind of really immerse themselves in understanding the Tree of Life symbol and the philosophy that goes hand in hand with that, because it was argued by these magicians that within the tarot was contained all of life's knowledge. Basically, it was a book of wisdom, and they really took the myth of its origin to heart in that regard. And you can see by the richness of the deck, the Rider-Waite deck that continues to exist today, that something valuable was at least created out of that milieu of influence.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is a bit of an aside, but it perked up my wonder whiskers when I heard about it. And I heard about this on, I don't think it was a mainline episode of Secret History of Western Esotericism, but he has a separate podcast called The Oddcast, which is like, because he goes in sequence, like historical
Mm.
sequence for Secret History of Western Esotericism, but he'll do kind of related but one-off topics and conversations on this other one. And he was talking about the role of drama in mystical and magical practices. And
Mm-hmm.
he had a scholar who specializes in this that he was talking to. I forget her name, unfortunately. But it's one of those things where when you see it in the historical context and how just ubiquitous dramas are at this point in history, right? I mean, like the influence of Shakespeare is massive, all these other things. But there's really a straight line between dramas, like acted out dramas, and magical practices. And
Sure.
then
Yeah.
once you draw that line and you realize that what you're trying to do is, in a strange way, probably exactly what the Egyptians were trying to do on a much larger scale with the pyramids, where
Mm.
they're arranging them in this sacred order to reflect these sacred properties. That's what you're doing in these magical rituals. You're acting out, you're embodying these archetypal things. And by embodying these archetypal things, you slowly absorb them, become them, in the same way
Right.
like that the cards, by imbuing these images in them, you're creating this little symbolon of whatever this archetypal thing is. The idea is by doing the drama over and over and over again, you slowly start to become the thing. So that was something I was like, oh yeah. Because the skeptical point of view is like, you're LARPing, buddy. You're pretending. You're playing a little role playing game in robes with your friends. And again, that part of my psyche and judgment is 100% there. But at the same time, if you really believe or can play with the idea that we live in this world of correspondences where all this stuff is really here and it's just like floating about in some kind of astral soup, and you can draw it in, invoke, evoke, expel all of those powers through doing the right things over and over again, occupying the right states of consciousness over and over again, suddenly the dramas make a lot more sense.
Yeah.
Suddenly, like what we look at today is like, well, they're doing what? They're dressing how? They're saying what?
Sure. It's easy for us to make fun
Yeah.
of it. Well, that's the thing. It's easier to poke fun at something than to, risk having to change your own outlook about something that's a core belief system, that you've applied yourself to for many years. So there's this writer on esotericism who was a member of the Golden Dawn named Israel Regardier.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he was also an assistant / secretary to Aleister Crowley, the famed ceremonial magician of the Golden Dawn, who was then ousted in very dramatic fashion in a wizard battle. See, I can't help but laugh.
Well,
But
tell me more about because I knew about him being essentially just like dismissed, kicked out, hated by the other members.
Oh
I
man,
didn't. I don't know if I knew that there was a wizard battle.
Oh man, it's just ripe for somebody to pick it up and create a film out of it. I'm honestly ashamed of humanity that there isn't a film yet about the wizard battle of 1900. So what ended up happening is that Aleister Crowley, also famed black magician, some would call the Beast 666, as he embraced as his title. He was a very decorated member of the Golden Dawn, ceremonial magician, and amongst this group of also very very philosophically minded, very well studied members of the order. And at one point, he started to have a lot of disagreements with them about the core aspects of what the Golden Dawn system was trying to achieve. Essentially, the Golden Dawn system was ceremonial magic that wasn't trying to cause direct influence on the world for material
Right.
gain of the individual. It was more for humanity's sake, for the elevating of consciousness and
Union
spirituality.
Union with the divine, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Very virtuous aims. Aleister Crowley comes along and says, well, we should twist this so that we can benefit from all the work we're doing. And, I want to be wealthy. I want to be successful. This stuff is, ripe for the picking. We can just turn it around and direct it toward our personal lives. So there were very intense disagreements with that among the members of the craft there. William Butler Yeats being one of them. And MacGregor Mathers seemed to be on the side of Crowley, at least
Initially,
an ear,
Okay.
to these kinds of rumblings. And so he advises, MacGregor Mathers tells Aleister Crowley that, well, why don't you go into our headquarters and just grab what you can from the doctrines, the most important papers, and go reestablish the Golden Dawn somewhere else under your new vision. And he even advised him how he should dress for this kind of assault, which he should wear traditional Celtic attire and armor. And he brings his trusty ritual blade to do so. So he breaks in to the lodge, to the headquarters of the Golden Dawn. But the members are already inside of it. And what ensues, it can only be called a wizard battle, because apparently the story goes that as he was trying to climb the steps toward where the main office was that contained all of their documents, William Butler Yeats shows up, and they start to basically with their ceremonial knives, shout incantations and spells at each
Wow.
other and
I,
curses, which even later on in later years they continued to kind of try to cast curses on each other. And as those were having no physical effect, um, Yeats resorts to the next best thing and does a Spartan kick on Aleister Crowley, and he flies down the stairs.
really? Wow.
And then the police are called, and he is taken off the premises, and he doesn't acquire those precious documents he was looking for, and he goes off, and in the following years founds his own school and order called Thelema, which continues to this day under what's called OTO, which is the Order of Thelema, which is his own,
Yeah.
brand of that magic system.
Where are these dramatic bits captured? Because some of I knew the broad strokes, but I never heard that.
Yeah, I mean they're captured in biographies and stories from the surviving members, and I mean, that's my understanding of it. Yeah,
And it's so for anybody that doesn't know this whole interesting little world. So that guy that we mentioned, Israel Regardier, um, it's so interesting that he worked for Crowley because he doesn't seem to have any of the questionable motives or rough edges. He
sure.
seems very, very much dedicated to this path of like really devotional, you know, communion with God, basically, and and living your own highest self in the light
Yeah,
of a higher power. And it's because of this guy Regardier that we now know a lot of what they were doing. Apparently,
right.
he canonizes or writes all of these practices down. You can buy this book um, right now on Amazon that tells you how to do
Yeah,
everything they were doing.
the rituals of the Golden Dawn.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yep. Um, so yeah, that's a whole interesting, somewhat tangential, I guess, element to this whole conversation, but it can't be ignored because it's fun stuff. I was honestly, I'm sure you've seen those like LARPing uh videos that have gone around social media, people going fireball at each other
oh
and stuff like that. And that's what I was thinking about when you were saying that they were casting at each other. But um despite the fun poking, man, it kind of seems like whatever they were trying to do to Crowley worked because he had
hmm,
a pretty bumpy and rough go of it, and seems like
hmm.
his life. I don't know his biography by heart by any means, but it certainly seems like his life didn't turn out great, and I don't know if he died poor exactly, but I know he wasn't like thriving in a
No,
lot
no.
of
I mean,
elements of his life.
yeah, I mean he was a character of his own right, and you can argue, whatever difficulties he faced in life, he certainly didn't make it easier to have people like him more. He was a very headstrong personality. He, unfortunately, not through exactly his own designs, became addicted to heroin
Hmm.
because of a physical element he had that at the time they were prescribing heroin for. And so the latter half of his life, he was a drug addict, and he can't kick the habit because who can, a heroin, and especially at the time where it wasn't viewed as a so intensely of a problem of an addiction issue as it is now. So that colored a lot of the latter half of his life. But he did have, a sect of people that and rich people who followed him and supported him and gave him money when he needed money. And his influence, whatever you say about his character,
Yeah,
his influence on what modern occultism is, it cannot be discounted.
yeah,
There's even just the physical existence of the Book of Thoth tarot deck that he designed with
yeah. It's a
with an
beautiful
artist.
deck. Beautiful deck.
Yeah, and uh, his understanding of kind of developing a syncretic system that tied in everything. I mean, astrology, Kabbalah, all the Hebrew characters, and a myriad of other influences into like one cohesive, web, was very impressive. So you can't write him off entirely,
No,
despite what you can say about the character of the man. His influence remains.
for sure, for sure. Yeah, and I mean, I have read some of his work over the years, and he's obviously very well informed, very experienced in a multitude of approaches, like both later in life, especially both Eastern and Western. He's combining like yoga in with things, and a lot of like Vedic and whatever influences. So yeah, I mean, he's definitely brilliant, definitely kind of like multimodal trickster genius, despite the fact that he definitely seemed to have questionable motives some of the time. But anyway, when you were talking about the wizard battles, do you know about uh, the famous case of Plotinus being magically attacked?
No, no.
Okay.
That
So
sounds
this
great.
this is kind of fun. So Plotinus, he's considered this sort of person who lights the wick of what would be called Neoplatonism. He's like
Hmm.
lives in about 200 CE, um and is developing quite a following for his teachings, and he is really almost like a borderline ascetic type character. He is really
Hmm.
living the life, really following the philosophic virtues. He's vegetarian. He's doing very much what sounds like meditation on a daily basis. Like when you read the Enneads, he's talking constantly about go inward, remove yourself from sensory input. If you want to know the form of the good, if you want to know the higher realities, like the way up is in. You have to go in and you
Hmm.
will like eventually reach this sphere of mind, sphere of nous, all this stuff. And
Hmm.
it's worth listening or reading, because you can find this on YouTube and stuff. But the beginning of the Enneads, which is the book of his teachings, was captured by his also brilliant student Porphyry. And in the
Hmm.
beginning, Porphyry offers a biography, which this tale comes from. Um, but he also, speaking of people's character, he also just speaks very highly of his character. Like
Hmm.
people would entrust him when they would die to arrange their affairs and distribute money, take care of children, and he apparently always came through and was always just really exemplifying the things that he preached.
Hmm.
So anyway, at some point, someone kind of and his name is known. I can't think of his name, but he's another philosopher or thinker, um, and he's essentially jealous of what Plotinus is accomplishing.
Right.
So he starts attacking him using what they call "quote unquote" astral magic or star
Okay.
magic. So again, we're talking, this idea that we're in this interconnected thing. Like if you can draw this energy down somehow, you can also use it to attack people. But what ends up happening is everything the guy tries to do to Plotinus starts happening to him.
Okay.
Like Plotinus, and he at some point apparently admits that, like, yes, I could tell what was trying to be done, but
Hmm.
um but yeah, it was easy for me to basically just reflect it back or something like that. Like because at this time you definitely have people doing today what we would call ritual magic. Like the word
Hmm.
uh not theurgy, but theurgy, yes. Like theurgy is essentially what, from my understanding, the Golden Dawn was kind of trying to do, where they're trying to
Hmm.
merge with
Right.
the divine, um through their rituals. But there's also today what we would call goetia, and
Hmm.
goetia was this practice that's more in line kind of with, I don't want to say Crowley, because Crowley was also doing this like higher kind of magic too, but basically the kind of magic where you're trying to get stuff for yourself, low
Right.
magic, the kind of
Sure.
magic where you're trying to like, bind or hurt other people and stuff like that.
Sure.
So this is going on, and yeah, apparently like Plotinus, like the virtue armor on Plotinus's soul was just like impervious to
Wow.
this low magic. Did I ever tell you about? There's one more just amazing story. Did I ever tell you the story about him going to the temple of Isis where they called up his daimon?
No, that sounds wonderful.
Dude,
What is that one?
it's so crazy. Um, so again, I guess I'll introduce the idea of the daimon again. So in Greek thought, stretching it, back, um, at least to, I'm positive that this is pre-Plato, but the most famous instance of this is in book 10 of Plato's Republic, the myth of Ur. It's a near-death experience story. This soldier
Hmm.
tells the story about how when a soul is dying and goes through the other world and then reincarnates, it gets this intermediate being attached to it called a daimon. And yes, this is where
Hmm.
we today get the word demon, but it does not have the same connotation. The idea is that there's just this spiritual being that,
Hmm.
like a guardian angel is the modern version of it, that
Right.
is attached to your particular soul and your particular fate. And this was a widely held idea that you had this daimon, this guardian spirit,
Right.
in the Hellenistic world and probably beyond that. So, of course, Plotinus being this really highly thought of philosopher, people were like, "Wow, you must have a hell of a daimon." Like, um, he's living in Rome at this time, and there's no place considered pure enough to do this ritual. But there's
Hmm.
one Egyptian priest who's working at a temple of Isis, actually. And he says, "This is the only ritualistically pure enough place where I can make your daimon manifest." And he's like,
Hmm.
if you want me to do this, I can do this. And he's like, I don't care about this. And his students are like,
Hmm.
no, no, do it. Please do it. So he goes, he's like, okay, fine, let's do it. So they do the ritual. And what comes forth is so powerful that there's like a couple things they say happen. Like basically everybody's just like frozen and struck with like awe and terror. And then there's this really cryptic thing said about the birds that they held dying. And no one
Hmm.
knows what this means. So they think
Hmm.
that maybe it has some like ritual implication, like they were doing something with birds.
Right.
Um,
Sacrifice.
yeah, possibly.
Hmm.
So anyway, what comes forth is a god, not a daimon. And basically
Ooh.
everybody's just like, oh my, like you're legitimately chosen to be doing what you're doing. Um, so yeah, just a couple,
Oh
couple
man.
fun Plotinus stories. Yeah.
That's like, yeah, in the first story, it sounds like Plotinus used the Uno reverse card.
You're right. Yeah, yeah.
And in the
Astral
second
Uno
story,
reverse. Yeah.
he used the Uno wild card
Yeah. Yeah.
to go back to card games. But wow, yeah, that's wonderful. I love that.
Yeah. So we did say that you are doing this tarot series now for your show. Um, how are you planning to attack this, and what angles of this haven't we? Because there's still so much stuff we haven't talked about. But um, how are you envisioning covering this, and also what have we not talked about? Because I know that there's more that you're probably burning on the tongue to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I'm hoping to get across with this kind of series is, aside from the rich history of this tradition and how it interweaves with all these other traditions we were talking about, is what would like a functional relationship with the tarot look like
Mm,
for anyone,
yeah.
even for skeptics, even for people who have no religious or spiritual bone in their body. And I think that this practice that I initially started as an experiment, there's actually great value to it. And so maybe even for your listeners, I would kind of offer up this challenge to give this a try, which would be for 7 days, take a pack of tarot cards, and perhaps at night before you go to bed, shuffle them up, lay them out face down, and ask the deck a question. Very simple, one sentence question. And then pick two cards. We'll say why two cards in a moment, but then put the cards back together, reveal them in order, and reflect on them. Ponder on what this could mean. And if you don't know what those cards mean in terms of, the encyclopedia definition, no worries. Because the idea is this kind of Jungian approach, let's say, to reading these cards is that kind of opening yourself up to what symbols and stories you see playing out in front of you will, like we were talking about earlier, pull out something from your unconscious
Yeah.
that helps in the answer of that question and resonates with something. And then you're projecting something onto the cards that's maybe an archetype or a story or an issue. And in that process, there's an interplay and a conversation. And there's great value in that. And then you can, if you're still confused, look at what the official, let's say, meaning is, which usually comes, with one of those decks of cards and a little
Mhm.
booklet, and then reflect on it further to see, how that might pivot things. But overall, you'll either have that initial reaction of like an aha moment, or going to bed and, like I did, waking up the next day, that reaction comes. And I end up throughout the day kind of holding these symbols, these images in my mind, and more realizations occur as the day goes on. It's almost like this, walking meditation in a sense, or your unconscious continuing to kind of mull over things and bringing them forth in little ways to you. And by the end of the day, I completely understand, what those two cards were from the last night. And it's become a really rewarding experience. And the reason I say 7 days for this kind of thing is because you want to, at the end, be able to just also reflect on all those things that were told to you. You don't want to rush through those insights. And then I think no matter who you are, you'll find some value in that kind of experience.
Yeah, yeah, experimenting with any of these consciousness altering, reality augmenting technologies, I think is a very interesting thing to do, particularly if you're feeling, because this is just such a pernicious, common feeling. We're all in our routines. We're all doing the same shit we always do. We might have some outlets for interacting with the numinous, with the mysterious, with the psyche. But adding something like this really brings a spice, like a noticeable spice to
Mm,
that, and really reliably brings up things that you didn't that surprise you. Again, using my metaphor of casting the fish bait into the waters of the unconscious again, what you catch is very interesting. And
right.
my 2 cents is I do like the intuitive way of looking at it, but I also like referring to the intended definition because I think that makes it extra meta because that definition didn't come from your mind then.
True. Yeah.
That you didn't project, but it's like they're both serving a purpose. So I like both.
Right.
I like the idea of write down your raw reaction like you're describing. Um Try to make sense of it. Try, write down what really strikes you or what it makes you think of. But I can't resist looking up the archetypal meaning and knowing all the different layers of meaning, because that for me calls up even more levels of meaning, like the example I was
Right.
using before about having a question about my own damn vocation, which is all communication based, and me drawing
Mm,
3 sword cards, which,
hmm.
if you just drew 3 sword cards, you may not know that all has to do with communication, that all has to do with that archetype of air, Mercury, communication, symbols, whatever. And like that just floored me, man. And those are things that might not be, those are at least ways of interacting with it that you might not know if you're just going through your own subconscious, which again, I do like and I do think people should do. I'm not saying don't do that, but I like it for that reason too.
Sure, sure. Yeah. I mean, from seeing, I'm not going to obviously speak about your reading, but I will say that, like, the one you showed me, there was a story being told.
Yes.
So these symbols, because a lot of them are very archetypal, and our stories, the ones that last through the generations, are archetypal stories. We end up seeing a story play out in front of us, whether we have 2 cards or 3 cards or more, and so we react to that, I think, as well. So that's partially, I think, what's going on there. If you end up seeing a reaction from just kind of 2 or 3 cards in a row, and the story they tell.
Yeah. One thing we haven't touched on, I know Jung, you said, didn't go very deep into the tarot, if at all. Um, by the way, I just got a book by Kevin Liu and I think Yeoman is her name. I'm Anne Yeoman, I think is her name. They're both professors of. Um, he's a professor of psychoanalysis, and I had him on my show uh, months ago now. But anyway,
Mm,
they collaborated to create a book called Jung's Collected Works, Carl Jung's Collected Works, the Basics or something.
mm.
And one of the aims is to give a general overview of his theory to an uninitiated person. But the other thing that Kevin specifically put a ton of time in on is breaking down subjects and where Jung talks about those subjects in his collected
Oh, I
works.
see.
Because
Right.
obviously it's like massive and it's so hard to know, like, where does he mention this? Where does he mention that?
Right.
So that to some degree, I'm wondering if that's in there, like, or just his discussions of divination are would maybe be more likely. Um, but one, though he apparently, at least to our knowledge, doesn't have many direct commentaries on tarot. he
No,
did
yeah,
get very into I Ching.
sure,
And I
yeah.
Ching he saw as this sort of, I believe he did say that it was essentially like this synchronicity engine, or ways to pierce into that layer of reality. Is that, how fresh on your mind is that, or how versed in his thoughts on the I Ching are you?
Not as well versed, not as well versed. But I mean, I was going to say that there are, current Jungians that have produced really great works
Oh yeah.
about taking the tarot and seeing it from the lens of Jung. So this is Tarot and the Archetypal Journey. It's a wonderful, very good standard book on that. The Jungian Path from Darkness to Light by Sally Nichols, and it reads very much like a Jung kind of textbook, and it's filled with imagery, of medieval artworks and stuff like that relate to things. And of course, it takes the path of individuation and kind of lays them
Oh
out
yeah,
across the
yeah.
major arcana and such. And again, the other Jungian I mentioned, who had great lectures, you can find on the website of the C.G. Jung Institute of Chicago, is Kenneth James. And so those ideas do exist, and they're expressed in wonderful, wonderful ways. One of the things about the major arcana that like is a very Jungian idea is that throughout the progression of those cards, you see the interplay of dualities and the union of opposites being a very key theme. So, like, even let's say something as seemingly obvious or direct as the Strength card, which is okay, a woman pulling open the jaws of a lion, but then you realize, like, oh, the lion is male, it has a mane, the woman is a woman, and these kinds of interplays are playing
Yeah.
throughout. Either a figure is represented in an androgynous way, or male and female as a uniting aspect, or a union of the opposites, which is obviously a very Jungian idea, is being shown through its progression. So yeah, there's a lot of fun stuff.
Yeah, this is one thing I can't believe we haven't addressed, is what the story is that's running throughout the deck. Um,
Mm.
because obviously, at least through the major arcana, there is like a story progression that is essentially a mirror for what could be called individuation or the hero's journey. And the transformation, the sort of archetypal alchemical transformation of the psyche from individual, egotistical, unworldly, self-concerned persona to what we could call the archetype of the capital S self, the rubedo, the whatever, which is symbolized, um, well, first by the fool, the zero card, and then by the world, right?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, there's an impressive way of looking at the progression from even from Fool to World card, and there's enough of like an interlinking between the cards that one can't help but assume there's a linear thread that connects them. But at the same time, I think there is great value of seeing them as perhaps they were intended to be seen, which is uh, an arrangement of cards that create stories through them being reshuffled. But there are aspects that kind of again echo from card to card, like even the fact that we have the Fool, which is the zero card. So technically, the Fool is not the first card. It can be it traverses the range of all the other cards, and in some very early tarot decks, which were considered the ones where it's more of the game, the Fool was actually placed after the World,
Mm,
considered after the World.
mm,
But like, let's say, even just looking at what would be then card number one, the Magician, who, let's say, in the Rider Waite is holding up the wand. One thing to notice about the Magician is that he doesn't look old like the Hermit.
right.
He's still youthful. So he's an inexperienced magician. It's the beginning of his or her journey as well.
Yeah.
And laid out on that table is very much the representation of what all of the tarot is about. He's holding a wand, which is one of the suits, and he's got the pentacles, a sword, and a cup on the table as well. And of course, he's directing his wand upward while pointing his other hand downward, in an as above, so below, and as within,
Yeah.
so without kind of gesture. And there's a lot to be gleaned from that image. But then let's say you go to the end of the journey, which is the world, which shows in the rider waite what looks like a woman, although in earlier versions it looks androgynous. But you would say that was the end of the journey. Somebody has united, all of their opposites in this ideal final form, of the trajectory of individuation, and they're still holding the wand. They're once again holding it. This is the beginning and end of the journey, and within the circle of this
Yeah,
this wreath that is shown. So yeah, there's a lot. The more you
there
look at
is.
it, the
Yeah.
more you see.
Yes, yes. And I never quite thought of it this way, but that as above, so below gesture that the magician is doing, the subtext to that is that there's this desire to unite the above with the self, right? Like trying to become the highest version of self, trying to merge with the divine through your earthly being. And in some ways the world is the attainment of that request, right? Because it's like the number one, you made this gesture, this desire to do what I just described, and then you get
Mm.
to the world and you're no longer a self. Like you've become a droplet of the all, of the everything,
Mm.
and you
Wow.
you
Yeah.
you hold everything within you, like that Jungian capital S self, um, archetype. And yeah, you bring up a really interesting and important point that I grapple with all the time, which is the fact that all these systems are presented as linear. Even, I mean, Jung obviously warned against this, but even individuation itself, right? It's sort of, you could see it as, it's like there's one, two, three, there's this archetype, this archetype, this archetype, and then you've like attained the self, and now you're all done.
Hmm.
Not that that's what it is, but you could read it that way. And that's not how life works. That's not how the psyche
Right.
works. Yet at the same time, I do think that there are very real things that are achieved. There are initiations that change you forever. But
Mm.
it's not like it wipes the slate of everything you were up to that point. It's like you're this and now. You're this and it's not
Right.
hypothetical. It's really a state of being and consciousness that you have achieved, at least temporarily. And I think that that matters, but it also doesn't, it's not like you get to the world card and then, um, okay, I was going to say, watch me just pick up the deck and it'll be the world, but it wasn't. Um, uh, it's not like you get there and you won the game or you completed the game. It's like
Mm.
they're all existing at once. All potentials
Right.
are existing at once. You're in all potentials at once. And it's like, did you have, and man, I could go on and on and on, but I won't. But I will say that, I'm deep into making this Plato's Cave video and what it really
Mm.
means, and what's really being prescribed there once you total up all the ideas and go to the deeper layers of meaning and get into the commentary of people like Proclus, who was deeply into this esoteric
Mm.
stuff
Right.
and was reading Plato's Cave in a very different way than
Mm.
going to a philosophy 101 class. But I will say that that reading of it really orbits this whole idea of what we're talking about. This idea of what you are, where you're aiming, and what you're trying to become is a
Hmm.
very, very central, important idea, while at the same time containing the multitudes. It's balancing that is just a very, I guess the fool card comes to mind, or the jester juggling comes to mind, because it's like you're
Right.
always juggling the profane and the holy and the worldly and the at the same time.
Yeah. Absolutely agree.
I know that this is something you, as a seeker, as somebody who is actively engaged in this stuff in ways we haven't even talked about. But everybody just assumed that MJ is a serious wisdom seeker and he has done things in his life to try to further himself, not just intellectually, but psycho-spiritually. How do you view that? Like this idea of like, yeah, I'm everything at once versus I am progressing versus something is different about me now than when I was 20. how do you balance this idea of progress with being in this constant loop where it's like there is linear progress, but it's also just this looping cycle of what it is to be human and have a human psyche.
Hmm. I mean, I think at the end of the day, we all know what we should be doing and what our potentials are. And uh, the rest is just ornamental in a sense.
Mm.
If you get down to the core of the matter, deep inside of yourself, perhaps, the overarching self knows what the direction of the journey is. And if we were honest with ourselves, we have all the answers already. We don't need the tarot decks. We don't need to visit a therapist. We don't need all this stuff. Uh, in the core, when you look inside yourself, you know the truth to all of your questions, but we have blockages. We
Yeah.
have aspects of ourselves that defense mechanisms and coping strategies and compartmentalization and all this stuff that we build up these towers, right? To use
Mm-hmm.
a very powerful symbol from the tarot. And in the tarot, the tower isn't necessarily a negative thing. When you look at the esoteric traditions, the tower initially seems like the fearful conclusion of something, disastrous that you are trying to attain. But in this more spiritual and esoteric traditions, the tarot, the tower, is the moment that your comforts and your material view of the world comes crashing down, and you're faced with the spiritual reality of your existence.
Mm.
And the weight of that realization is catastrophic. And it's kind of a similar realization, I think, that uh, if we were honest with ourselves, we know what's going on,
Yeah.
but we are we're wrapped up in all these narratives, and through the assistance of things like the tarot and therapists and such, uh, they can help us see those things. So those would be my 2 cents, I think.
Yeah, brother. That was so well said, and I agree with all of it. And the thing that I would add, because I can't resist, is that one of the other things is that there's like this self-deception that occurs. Like, because I know, like I already have all the answers within me, so I don't need to do the shadow work. I don't need to do this. I don't need to consult that because I already know. And this is something I've seen in the YouTube comments, this like shadow projection over the years a lot.
Mm,
And it's specifically on that shadow video. It'll be like, why are you
mm,
focusing on the shadow? The way is the light. The way is this. The way is that. And it's like, if you don't see the shadow in yourself, you're living the fool card in a not
mm.
in a not. I guess it's true. Yeah, like you're full of potential. But if you haven't even crossed the threshold into seeing the ugliness you're hiding from yourself and the undiscovered territory, ugly or otherwise, that's the very first thing that needs to be done. And if you and again, this sounds so cryptic and Zen koan-y, but the other big insight is that yes, on the deepest possible level, I agree with you. I think we do know. I think the the point that Plato slash Socrates was making in the allegory of the young boy um realizing that he had like geometry in his mind already,
Right,
like
right. It's a discovery, not a learning. Yeah.
it's a just yeah, anamnesis. But it's like, yes, you know everything, but it's not you that knows.
Mm,
It's something in you that knows. And
mm.
that's a very important distinction because that's where you pry the ego away. And it's like,
Right,
no, it's not the ego that knows. It's
right.
this deeper knowing that you're connected to, but have to work for. You've got to fucking work for it. And this is again one
Mm.
of the other things Platonists are always hammering on about is I'll wrap it up with this because I know we're getting long in the tooth here in this episode, but why are they always banging on about math? How is math related to any of this shit we're talking about? Because that's a kind of knowing that you have within, like, you don't invent math, right?
Mm.
The universe really follows these principles. I think everybody listening can agree on that. So, what is it in you that can find that truth? Yet you don't just have the equation in your mind. There's something rationally, a progression you have to work through to get there, and then you attain it. You attain the truth in a way that is self evident and demonstrable, and all the way on up to we can imbue it in a computer and talk to each other on the internet, right? We're like
Mm.
imbuing these mathematical principles. That's you on
Right.
some level, but it's not you on the ego level of like, I don't need to do shadow work. It's you on the like on the world level of the tarot, right? It's you on the level that transcends the ego, transcends the persona, transcends all the archetypes even. But
Yeah.
it's like you have access to it if you work for it. And I hope that that felt relevant to the conversation. It seemed very relevant to me, but
Cheers. Cheers to that, brother.
I want you to have the last word though, because I'm very, very excited for what you're doing with this tarot series and your show in general. So any closing thoughts or things you want to tell people about, please let her fly.
Oh, I mean, I would just offer graciously that if folks want to check out what we're up to on the show, Creative Codex, to just follow us on Spotify. That's Creative Codex, CODEX. I'm also on Instagram at my name MjDorian, and I'm currently at work on that tarot series. But otherwise, we're also working on a few very exciting ones, which is a William Blake series,
Yeah.
which will come out before the tarot one, a special
Oh
Jim
wow.
Morrison series, which is going to be a Patreon exclusive. And I'm still doing Red Book readings every month, where I read a chapter of the Red Book and put original music to it and such. So we're having fun. It's a lot of good stuff up ahead.
Amen, brother. I truly love you. I'm so glad to have you
Love you
as a
too.
friend. And like, man, there are just some glimmering jewels of human beings I've connected with through this show over the years. And you are one that shines amongst the brightest. Uh, so I look forward to doing this many more times, my friend.
Likewise, likewise. I'm very flattered, and always a pleasure and an honor being in a conversation with you.